Hi everyone, welcome to Light Haven, the podcast for all things spiritual, mystical and energetic. My name is Bianca, lightworker and astrology enthusiast.
And I'm Ruth, mystery student towards the awakening of consciousness.
Today's episode is called Optimise Now, Bring On Your Badass Self. Wow, what a great topic. We all want to be a better version of ourselves, and we have our goals and plans, and it can almost seem like our emotions and circumstances can be a barrier for us, but they don't have to be. They can be a training ground. We're talking about resilience and are going to delve into the why, the what, and the how of it.
Before we get into this topic, I think it would be great for us to answer why it's so important.
Absolutely.
Maybe we can each explain our perspectives on what makes us passionate about resilience. For me, there's a personal side of it connected to my own history and life path. I have family members who have had their challenges, and I've watched these struggles personally as an observer. And there was also someone very close to me who was in a dark place. I came across Alistair a few years ago, and this was a great person with an upstanding job and position in a community. They were full of knowledge and training that should have set them up to be a great contributing member of society. And from the outside, those who were not in the know, that's what they thought he was. But as I got to know Alistair, I found that there was a darkness going on that was connected to addiction and substance abuse. And I witnessed what looked like to me someone's life going down the drain. And I have absolute compassion for how you can end up in that state, because it didn't happen overnight. If you looked at this person and went back 30 years before, they probably didn't know this was going to be how it was going to go 30 years later. But it happened slowly over time, different blows that life dealt upon them, and them not having adequate resources to face those challenges. They were knocked down so completely that it was the only thing they could turn to. And I found it very sad, such a loss of potential capability and contribution. So this experience with witnessing what mental health struggles had resulted in for this person, that made me passionate about well-being, and it also led me to spirituality as well. When we look at how a lot of people describe resilience, I loved one description from a book called Resilience by Design. And there are common keywords that you see appear. These are flow state, confidence, in control, even good stress, edgy, calm, excited, connected, and some people have used the word bitchy. There's a dialogue that I can share. So Carmen Martin was a 3-time Olympian and 2013 Taekwondo world champion. When she was interviewed, she was asked, "You won the first 4 rounds. What happened in the 5th?" Because she lost in the 5th round. So she was asked, "What happened in the 5th round?" And Carmen said, "I didn't do my usual mental preparation." Then she was asked, "What were you thinking that made you not prepare in the same way?" And she said, "Actually, I was feeling really good." So almost feeling too confident. And then she was asked, "Well, is feeling good an important part of your high performance state?" And she said, "No, I fight at my best. When I fight at my best, I don't actually feel good. I feel bitchy." So it's tapping into your emotions and harnessing them, channeling them for success.
I love that. For me, I've come to learn aspects of myself through astrology. And what I mean by that is I would lump resilience into that understanding of how I've acted in the past, or just these energies that are playing out inside of me, and I can understand through astrology how these energies are playing a part in my life and how I'm enacting these energies. But I'll explain a little bit more about that, because what I really want to do is I really want to speak from an astrological point of view with regards to resilience. Looking to our birth chart in astrology can give us insight into our strengths and weaknesses as an individual. For the past 2 episodes, I've mentioned the correlation between the heavens and our inner world and how they're interconnected. In a way, this is a return of a primal worldview where our external world is reflecting the energies that we're feeling inside. It's an acknowledgement that we are connected with our environment, and there's this heightened spiritual awareness. And regardless of what religion you identify with, there's this feeling of being at one with a divine source. Through this intimate connection, we can turn to our external world to find hints or clues as to why we might be feeling a certain way on an inner level. For example, we can look to the sky and see that maybe Mercury, the planet that signifies communication and how we intellectualize things, turns retrograde. And retrograde is where a planet appears from our view on Earth to be moving in a backwards motion in the sky. We suddenly find ourselves either stumbling with our words or binding contractual agreements that end up having problems that lead to a reversal of some kind. And I've got an example here of someone who went to purchase a car during a Mercury retrograde. And they signed the documentation and drove off with their new car. And when the retrograde season was over, and Mercury retrogrades only last about 21 days, so that's 3 weeks. So shortly after the purchase, the Mercury went station direct, so started moving forwards again in the sky, and then this person who had purchased that vehicle got a phone call from the dealership saying, sorry, there's been a issue with the paperwork and the contract didn't go through and the car needs to be repossessed and it's not actually yours. Sorry. And so he had to he had to give the car back. So that's just like a typical Mercury retrograde situation. And that's not to say that it's not to say that we should avoid contractual obligations or anything like that during Mercury retrograde season, because we can't really plan our lives around what the planets are doing, but it can increase our awareness as to the possibilities of what might happen, and to be a little bit more on guard, a little bit more diligent in the way you're speaking, the way you're coming across to others, the contracts that you're binding yourself to, these sorts of things. But you still have to live your life, you know.
But don't get married during that period.
In fact, Mercury goes retrograde today.
Oh dear. Well, I didn't plan anything binding today, so I think I'm safe. But so beware.
Mm-hmm. Now, okay, so when we look to the sky to see what's going on, in order to understand how this might be reflective of our inner world, we're essentially looking at transits. And the planets are constantly moving, and we can look to these transits to see how they're witnessing or looking at our natal planets. And the type of witnessing or viewing or looking that these transits make, that these transiting planets make, could be either a loving kind of witnessing or a dynamic, turbulent kind of witnessing. So as well as looking at transits, we can look at our birth chart, which is different from transits. So transits is, we look at the sky right now. What are the planets doing? But when we look at our birth chart, it's like a snapshot of the sky at the time of our birth. the placements of those planets at the time of our birth, as in what zodiacal sign those planets were residing in at the time of our birth and how they're configured to other planets in the chart, how they're speaking to each other, can give you an idea of the kind of life that you will lead. I'll get more into this later, but just with the transits aspect, the planets are constantly moving into what we call hard aspects, which are more dynamic and can be disruptive, and moving into soft aspects, which are more harmonious in nature. This is reflective of how we feel on a daily basis. Some days are good, some days are bad. Some phases of our lives are more difficult than others and can be a much more stressful time for us. I think it would be helpful if we defined what we understand stress to be.
Absolutely. Yeah. So let's talk about that. Mm-hmm. I think it would be a good place to go back to the official definition.
Yeah.
So
let's define it.
Yes. This is an official definition from the American Psychological Association that defines stress as it involves changes affecting nearly every system of the body, influencing how people feel and behave. For example, it can be manifested by palpitations, sweating, dry mouth, shortness of breath, fidgeting, accelerated speech, augmentation of negative emotions. So if you were already experiencing them, they get worse. Mm-hmm. And longer duration of stress fatigue. Now, there's also severe stress that is manifested by the general adaptation syndrome. So sorry, that's a little bit technical, but it's basically how your body responds to the environment. Mm-hmm. And this contributes directly to psychological and physiological disorder and disease. And it also affects both mental and physical health, hence a reduction in the quality of life. That's your general stress. There is also a whole breakdown into acute and chronic and so on. Now, what causes us to feel stressed? In this theory, we say that there is something called a stressor. And the stressor is anything that made us feel stressed. So if we perceive a person or a circumstance as threatening or dangerous, then to us it can become a stressor. It could be any kind of situation, whether in a work environment, and it could be just stressful to us, not necessarily to someone else. So we have the introduction of an outside circumstance or experience. Something's been introduced to us. We perceive it as dangerous, and then we start to have a response. So this response starts in the brain. And the perception of danger, that information is sent to the amygdala, and that's where your emotional processing takes place. It's the first part of the brain that goes danger, danger, danger. So then from there, the distress signal goes to the hypothalamus. And that's like a control center for the brain, which talks to the rest of the body. So that part of the brain will communicate with the body through the autonomic nervous system. And that's why you see all of these somatic experiencing therapies and somatic movements coming out, because they're trying to use a physical means of dealing with the automatic nervous system, or the ANS. And that system kicks in to tell the body, what are we going to do about this stress? And usually it's the popularly known fight or flight response. But the hypothalamus is that key connector that talks between the endocrine system and the nervous system. So maybe that sounds complicated. It's very to do with what's happening in the body, but there's a practical aspect to how the body responds. And these are things that we know from research that make sense to everyone. The first one is cardiovascular disease. So this tells us stress is not something we can make light of or ignore. Cardiovascular disease is any of a group of illnesses to do with the heart or the blood vessels. So it could be coronary heart disease, it could be stroke, it could be hypertension. And this type of disease actually accounts for the highest death rate amongst all diseases in most developed countries. That's what the research shows us. So even though we can look at all kinds of different aspects of life and say, oh, this is scary, that's scary, stress is the biggest thing that we need to look at when it comes to longevity. Now, besides this, there's also other evidence that shows that mental distress is something that can contribute to heart problems as well. So you have your regular stress, like working in a job you don't like, or having family members or friends around you that are negative. But if you move into a further difficult state where you're always turning over bad things in your mind, that is something else that can cause heart problems. So basically, we know that stress sounds bad. It's something we want to avoid. And besides problems with the heart, it can also cause high blood pressure. And, people always say that, oh, watch your blood pressure, don't get angry. But there is a research basis to it as well. And the research shows that if you're stressed for a long period of time, then you'll have blood pressure issues. It's an early sign of hypertension, and they've actually even looked at certain occupations and connected those occupations to hypertension. So this is the secular view of how if we find ourselves in certain challenges, there are certain physiological and mental responses, and it can be bad for us. But is there actually an astrological explanation for when and why these things happen, these stressors?
Yeah, there is this concept called detriment in astrology. I really just need to lay it all out, so just bear with me if it doesn't make sense at first. I'm hoping that after I say everything, it makes sense in the end. Mm-hmm. So I'll start by saying that the planets are constantly moving, like I said. They're moving into hard aspects with other planets, and they're moving into soft aspects with planets. And they're constantly moving through the sky from one sign to another. If a planet, planets also have rulership, which I get into a little bit later, and planets rule different signs. The signs that they rule are considered to be their home, and they feel like they can be themselves in their home sign. When a planet is in their home sign, we call that domicile. So if a planet being in its domicile is like a planet being at home, then there's the opposite of that, which is when a planet is in a sign that is opposite to its domicile. Then it's considered to be a planet in detriment, or a place of its adversity. When we look at a birth chart, it looks like a circle divided into 12 parts. These 12 parts are the 12 zodiacal signs, and they're numbered from 1 to 12. If house 1 is the zodiacal sign of Cancer, then its opposite sign is going to be in house 7, and that'll be the house of Capricorn. This opposition aspect is difficult because it signifies, in a more modern sense, duality, like the dark and the light. Mm-hmm. If the ruler of Cancer, which is the moon, feels at home in Cancer, house 1, then imagine if the moon moves through the sky and ends up in Capricorn, the exact opposite sign to it. It will feel like it is far away from its home. The moon in Capricorn is considered to be in detriment. Because it's so far away from its quote-unquote home, it can tend to feel like a foreigner in a foreign land, kind of like they're in exile. A planet in its home feels part of the establishment, whereas a planet in debility is some sort of outsider. It's either not recognized as being of importance or given any responsibility of anything, or just doesn't even want to be there. Also, I need to say this, debility is similar to detriment, except instead of the planet being opposite its home sign, it's actually opposite the sign of exaltation. But we don't need to get into that. Just know debility and detriment means opposite to where it's most comfortable.
So 2 kinds of bad.
Yes, 2 kinds of bad.
Got it.
The Astrology Podcast did an episode on essential dignities and debilities with guest speaker Charles Aubert. I don't know how to say
those French pronunciations are hard.
I know, right?
If he's French, then it's Aubert.
Yeah, he sounds American.
Oh, well, people will look him up. They'll know.
And I highly recommend that you listen to it if this is of interest to you guys. But they talk about, on that episode, about this concept in detail. And Charles makes a good point in saying that although it sounds bleak and unhelpful, being in exile or being in a sign opposite to your home sign, it can actually prove to be quite useful. Because if you are, quote, outside the system, then you're someone who's willing to change the system in some way. So yeah, it could be a useful dynamic and could be used as a force for change. So he says that. He also made a point that it's fairly common to see Mars in its detriment. For example, Mars in Taurus or Libra, is very competitive in solo sports. For example, Muhammad Ali.
Okay.
Arguably the greatest boxer of all time. He has Mars in Taurus on his midheaven, and we'll go through a little bit of his chart. I think this is an official time, so I'm comfortable in sharing it. So Muhammad Ali was born January the 17th, 1942 at 6:35 p.m. in Louisville, Kentucky. So that puts him as a Leo rising, meaning his first house is Leo, and the sun is in his 6th house in Capricorn. So one could see this as he's quite industrious and hardworking. The one that I really wanted to speak about, because there are a few aspects in his chart that signify opposition, detriment, and debility. All of these 3 things, which can indicate a very dynamic type of birth chart. He has, like I said, Mars in Taurus on his midheaven, which is in his 10th house. 10th house is like career, notoriety, reputation. But because it's in Taurus, he doesn't feel at home in Taurus. But so Mars being in that sign of Taurus can indicate some kind of uncomfortableness going on there intrinsically inside. He was considered a humanitarian and activist, and he converted to Islam and announced that he was no longer Cassius Clay, but he's now Muhammad Ali. So his old name was regarded as a slave name, even though the person he was named after was, I think it was his father was also named Cassius Clay, but Cassius Clay was a person who, he was an abolitionist, but he did own slaves at one point. So even though he got rid of his slaves, he didn't get rid of that white supremacy.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So we can see this type of action. We can see the house that the sign rules. Muhammad Ali would be his 9th house. So if you think of Mars as an actor, and Mars is acting out in a Marsy way, which he wants to like cut and sever. Like Mars was like the god of war in Greek mythology. And so he was combative, and he was great at boxing, in this combative sport. But Mars's agenda as an actor is not to be so much boxing, but his agenda is to act out more of 9th house significations, because Mars, although he doesn't rule Taurus, which is the sign that it's in, Mars actually rules the 9th house of Aries, and the 9th house signifies religion, faith, these sorts of topics, foreign travel. So Mars's agenda was more of like a religious kind. So he stood for something, right? He stood for, when he he converted himself to Islam and changed his name. He did it in quite a loud way because it was acting out in his 10th house of reputation and career and notoriety. So we see it acting out in the 10th house, but the agenda was driven by the rulership of Aries in the 9th house. So that is one chart example of how how a planet or an actor can feel like it's not comfortable, but still does a good job at persevering and bringing forth its significations in a way that that serves the purpose of the individual, which is Muhammad Ali, which we're speaking of. So that essentially is how astrology talks to when we experience difficulties, how we can predict when they will occur. Because there were also lots of other things that were happening in his progressed chart, which is a very astrological thing. Don't want to get into it. But in his progressed chart, when he came out and announced that he was converting to Islam, there were some significant things going on in his chart at that time, not from his natal chart, but his progressed chart, which is something different. But anyway, it can sound all complex at first, but if you get into it, it's a whole new world that can help people to feel at peace with situations that they're encountering, maybe even have a more accepting kind of view. And of course, people can go with any perspective that they find useful. I know you were studying quite a few different frameworks on well-being, Ruth. Didn't you even look at the Māori well-being perspective? Like, I'm Māori, but I'd be curious to know what they are putting in the, I guess, official coursework about Māori well-being.
Yes, so I've mentioned before that I'm studying psychology.
Yes.
And studying it in New Zealand, it wouldn't be complete without looking at all the different views, because I think that's the great thing about New Zealand. We're such a melting pot here, and the coursework acknowledges that the Western history and literature around psychology and well-being is just one view, and it comes from one particular culture, or kind of like groups of cultures that are connected. So Western world, we've got Australia, New Zealand, the US, we've got Europe, but with such large Pacifica and Māori groups here, it would be ridiculous of us to not look at all the other different views on well-being. So, of course, we do study that, and the Māori perspective on well-being is just one of the many different kinds. There are all these other models as well. So the model that's used, and if you ask anyone that's in mental health and well-being, they will know this. It's called Te Wharatapawha. And basically, to have wellness under this view, you have the structure of a house. And the house has walls and a roof, and each part of this house has different aspects that are represented. And it was first developed in the 1980s by Sir Mason Dury. And the 4 aspects are mental, physical, social, and spiritual. I really loved learning about this view because the spiritual aspect, which is referred to as wairua, it basically says that you may not be able to experience well-being without spirituality. And further in the coursework, then spirituality is defined not necessarily as a religion, though it could be. It is something that connects you to something greater.
Yes, that is wairua.
Yeah, exactly. So it could be, we see a lot of Māori churches or Pacifica churches, but it doesn't have to be within a religious framework. It can be your connection to the land, your connection to community.
That's that primal worldview. Yeah.
Exactly. So I love that that is being officially acknowledged and looked at as a way that we have to understand well-being for large parts of our population here. And I would venture to say we shouldn't just say this is for Modi. We need to take from that and see, well, what is missing in our Western psychological lens? I want Wairua as well. I like that connected view, that higher aspect of unity and community, and drawing on those things that give me power and energy to be my best self, whatever that looks like today or next year, and that freedom to choose what it is for me.
Totally. Thank you so much for sharing, Ruth. I love how there are endless ways to view the same thing. I think people can get into astrology through the zodiac signs, but then they discover there's so much more to it than that. But this discussion wouldn't be complete, I think, without looking at the aspects of the planets and the zodiacal signs. And I know we're kind of going back and forth here on different things, but there are planets, like I've said, and then there's the zodiacal signs. So the two things that I want to explain, firstly, starting with the planetary significations, I want to read a passage from a book called Ancient Astrology by Demetra George. This is from her Volume 1 edition. She says, Western astrology originated in Mesopotamia, where early astronomers identified the 7 visible planets. In their cosmological system, the celestial bodies were understood as one of the manifestations of the divine. The planets were named after gods and goddesses and imbued with their mythic and religious attributes. When the planets appeared in the sky, the planetary deities were thought to be communicating their wishes and intentions to humanity. The role of the astrologer was to carefully observe motions and positions of the planetary gods, note the corresponding terrestrial effects, and convey this information to the kings, who would then rule the country in accordance with divine intention. Yeah, so it's confirmed that these celestial bodies, aka planets, represented the attributes of the gods, goddesses that they were named after. They each communicated their wishes and intentions to humanity, and it is up to us to interpret what that message is. As astrology has developed over the centuries, we see that these planetary gods can take form as different manifestations. For example, the planets can symbolize, as Demetra George described, as, quote, active forces in the psyche that motivate a person towards his or her destination, close quote. And this leads me just quickly to the zodiacal signs. If we look to the sky, we can imagine the sky divided into 12 equal sections. I think I already mentioned this, okay? One for each sign, one section per sign. And each section is called house. These zodiacal signs were considered to be temples by the ancient Greeks, which served as the quote-unquote dwelling places for the planetary gods. And it sounds so romantic to say Venus, the god of desire and beauty, is exalted in the temple of Pisces, which, yeah, Pisces is in, Venus is in Pisces as we speak. So if you imagine that these signs are temples or dwelling places for the planets, then one must think that the sign now is in some way responsible to take care of their visiting guest. This is the key concept that I wanted to make here, is that as the dwelling place, aka sign, its responsibility is to provide its guest, the planet, with resources and power so that the planetary god can act out its purpose. And I use that example of Muhammad Ali. And please note, these zodiacal signs, have a planetary ruler, which I mentioned. When the ruler of a sign is transiting through the sign that it rules, it is said to be at home, and it feels the most comfortable there. And sometimes you can have a number of planets sitting in one sign.
Is that like a party?
Yeah, like a party. We call it a stellium when there's 3 or more planets in one sign. If the planetary ruler is at home, it can easily take care of all of its guests. Mm-hmm. Making sure the pantry's stocked, making sure all the planets have the Wi-Fi password and have their own place to rest. But when the planetary ruler is not present in their home sign, then the visiting planet is left to fend for themselves and can feel lonely and isolated.
Got it.
Mm-hmm. Another example is where a planet is residing in a temple, aka sign, that is opposite to their home sign. I think I mentioned this earlier. They are in a place that is the furthest away they could be from their home. Almost like they're in a foreign land. They don't know the language. They don't have any social status. It is an uncomfortable feeling for them. Sometimes as humans, when our backs are against the wall, we put extra effort into making that hustle because we have to work harder just to survive. And planets are like actors, and the signs that they reside in are like their environment that feeds them that resources, for good or for bad. The planets are actors wanting to act out their agenda, and we look at their sign that they rule. And that will give us the topics of the agenda. And it can get a bit complicated, but like I said, reiterate the example that I gave of Muhammad Ali, his birth chart, where his Mars was in a house in the 10th house, representing career and reputation. And Mars, like I said, in Greek mythology, was named after the god of war. It wants to cut and sever. So you see, he does that in the boxing ring. But Mars's agenda was that of a religious, philosophical, and higher-minded type of purpose, because Mars rules the 9th house of religion, faith, and foreign travel. So he takes a stand and converts to Islam.
Right.
And changes his name as a way of denouncing slavery. So these are some effective concepts that can give people a way to feel better about how many events can suddenly show up and seem so random. But what does this classic psychology advice tell people for how to deal with challenging events once they arise? Like, that's the astrological lens that I've just mentioned. But on the psychology side of things, I have no idea.
Yeah, well, I think this connects really well because the astrology says, here's what can happen in your life, or here's why it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. But then once we know what we're dealing with, we still have to know what actions we're going to take in response to them. So the psychological lens can help people with the how do they respond. So we talk about coping mechanisms. And coping basically refers to what are the things that we do to respond to the stressors that we are being bombarded with. There are things that we want to do to reduce both the feeling of and the impact of unpleasant emotions. So we don't want to suppress them, but we do need to know what to do with them and process them in a healthy way. Now, one point to reiterate, and we've talked about this when we've talked about mindfulness, but whether an event seems to us to be good or bad, all comes from the mind. We know that that is a very strong view held in a lot of traditions like Buddhism, these Eastern philosophies where they say all suffering comes from your mind. What if I didn't identify or connect with any of those traditions? Well, the modern literature and research says the exact same thing, that whatever the event, the suffering and the difficulty comes from how we perceive it, how we interpret it. So we never want someone to say that, oh, it's difficult because of you, but essentially that is what the research tells us. We like to try and blame people and circumstances. My boss is making me feel that way. They're so difficult to work with. My family member is making me feel that way. They don't understand me. all of these troubles that we think outside of us are making us suffer. But actually, the research says that it's the story we tell ourselves about those things that happen that makes it feel good or bad for us. So one classic example is if someone rocks up to you and insults you in a foreign language and you don't understand it, then you're not going to take offense or feel badly about it because you can't assign meaning to what they said, so you don't feel hurt by it. But if someone comes up to you and says something and you understand it, then you can feel really badly and say, oh no, they said this to me and they're so mean, and turn it over in your head. So we know that the mind is what creates the stress and the suffering. It's easier said than done when it comes to, okay, what do I do about it? And that's why we look at what tools we can use to help us. So classically, we divide our coping mechanisms into two groups. There's adaptive and maladaptive. Adaptive is methods that can be helpful for us, and maladaptive is maybe it helps you in the short run, but in the long run, it makes it worse. So adaptive approaches would be maybe you start thinking about how I'm going to solve the problem. And that's how you deal with your emotions. You're actually driven by solutions. And the research shows that that is actually one of the best methods. In fact, it's better than talking to a friend or a therapist, even though those are good things. When you look at how to solve the problem, you're going to remove the stressor. So that's why research shows that that's the best way. But for you to get into a good headspace to come up with a strategy, maybe you do need to go and get on the phone and have a yarn with your friend and vent first. But that would be the best way to deal with it. Now, there's another kind or a category of adaptive coping mechanism called appraisal focused. And appraisal focused is where you use a series of or different kinds of techniques to help yourself feel better about it. That's where maybe you make light of the situation. You crack some jokes and you say, oh, it's not that bad. Or you rationalize, you reason why, oh, they were having a bad day, so that's why they said that, and they don't really mean to hurt me. You can also use some very structured techniques that you might see in a therapeutic setting, and there's also spirituality as well. Now, maladaptive, I don't even think we need to explain it. It's obviously substances.
Yeah.
And the research shows that those substances are linked to more bad emotions, so distress, anxiety, and depression. But the things that we often forget about are eating disorders, social media, gaming, and isolation. And those do need to be called out because so we have such a forgiving and compassionate modern culture because we're more aware, and that's great. But sometimes it can be abused to where we are enabling maladaptive practices. Mm-hmm. So we'll encourage our friends, oh, eat the donut, you only live once, where maybe actually if they have high blood pressure, they shouldn't be having too many donuts. Mm-hmm. And that's a hard one. It's not for us to say, to tell people what they should and shouldn't do. It's just something to be aware of. In the very least, we shouldn't be encouraging it. If we notice that someone is, say, resorting to social media a lot and almost using it as an escape, and they're not getting out of the house anymore, then of course we can't judge them and say, oh, you've got a bad habit because you're feeling depressed. No, but we can say, hey, are you all right? Do you want to go out and do this thing with me? Let's go to the movies. Let's go get a coffee. So just being aware that that's not something that we judge, but neither is it something we want to encourage because
or enable.
Exactly. Yeah. If we go, oh, it's fine. You've got to be happy, right? We need to recognize that is something that's not going to make our friend happier, mm-hmm. or ourselves for that matter. So I wanted to share 3 practical techniques that people can take away that they can use because we're talking about resilience and we have all of these concepts and ideas and language that we can use to describe why things happen, how they happen, what's happening in our body, and we're talking about what we can do about it, it would be impossible for me to list all the techniques. There's so many of them, and that's not the purpose of this episode. But if I can give people something they can do tomorrow, or maybe they don't want to do these things, but they can go, there could be other useful techniques that are similar that will be better for me. They can start looking into it and finding what works. And the key here would be consider applying them. Because if we stuff our heads with all these techniques and we never do them, then we're none the better off. So the first point I wanted to make is around how perception creates reality. It's not necessarily a technique as such, but it's a concept that once you grasp it, you just keep it in mind as you're dealing with difficult things. So you remind yourself, hey, the research shows perception creates reality. So there's something we call inattentional blindness. And the example came from an experiment that was carried out by Daniel Simons and Christopher Chabris. So there were two groups of people, and these people were made to wear different colors. So some were wearing white shirts and some black. And they were set up to look like they were playing a game of basketball, but they weren't really. They were just passing the ball around randomly and moving in different ways. Now, subjects were asked to watch the game, and they were called to, okay, look at the people wearing the white shirts and count how many times do they pass the ball. So as people are focusing and watching, okay, 1, 2, because if they pass it to someone wearing a different color, okay, I don't count that. So they're really focused. Now, during this experiment, someone wearing a gorilla suit came up in the background and was there for about 9 seconds and disappeared. And when they asked the observers, did you see them? They didn't. A lot of them did not observe the gorilla. So then the next phase of the experiment was, okay, we're going to tell them about the gorilla. So now they're aware of it. And then when the observers went to watch again, then the researchers would change something else, like, I'm going to change the curtain color and see if they notice it. Or I'm going to get this person to walk over here and see if they notice it. And most people then didn't notice the other new things. So what that experiment tells us about how our brain works is that it doesn't matter how much we know and learn and prepare, we perceive the reality that we're expecting. And as soon as it's something we didn't expect, we actually don't see it at all. So that experiment shows us that whatever we believe is going to create our reality.
That's such a good point to make, because then there's also that confirmation bias, right? We build up this narrative in our head and it plays out before our eyes. That's like what you've said right here is this little experiment is so eye-opening, because I think if we can take away this knowing that we only see that which we want to see, we could be a little bit more aware of our own biases.
That's right. That's right. So if we think, oh, this person at work has it out to get, has it out for me, or they're out to get me, then everything they do in our head will think, oh, they did this because of this. Yeah. They did that because of that. Yeah. And I know someone who was saying, oh, I think that manager purposefully didn't give me this opportunity. And I said, how do you know that they purposefully did that? And they said, no, I don't know, but I think. And I was like, oh, okay. So I was just sort of bringing up a little bit of doubt around our individual bias.
Yeah.
But it's very hard when you're in it. It's so easy to be from the outside. And that's why talking about things with your friends and your circle is so important, because they can share another view. Yeah,
and I think it's also important not to forget our intuition as well. But I think if we can take away this idea of confirmation bias, or this idea that we only see that which we want to see, then it could open our minds up to the possibility of other scenarios that could be at play, as opposed to the story that we're telling ourselves in our head, but not to override our intuition and our inner knowing, like that gut instinct, but to also try and back it up with more factual things before coming to a conclusion.
Yeah, and I'm not saying, you need to listen to what all your friends tell you, and sometimes your gut is right with no evidence, but it's a fine balancing act, and you have to go deeper and deeper into your core to go, okay, is this my judgment or my insecurity or...
Exactly. I was just thinking that because I was thinking, how do we know that it's not like our inner wounded child playing out? That can be very loud and it could cloud your perception if you're not aware of where these things are coming from inside yourself.
Yeah.
Not recognizing whether you're being triggered or whether it is genuinely, actually a true reality. But our reality is what we see ourselves. So if we can maybe cloud our reality with a little bit more, positive open-mindedness, then we could be a little bit more adaptive. Oh my gosh, that reminds me. Sorry.
No, go for it.
There was this thing on Instagram, a reel on Instagram that I listened to, where there was a lady talking about emotional resilience, and the people who were more flexible and more adaptive, they had a lot more higher emotional resilience.
Yeah, definitely. Flexibility is so important. And I guess that's what these techniques are all about. It's about how you work with your mind. If you're less flexible, what are the things you can do? I came across a few of what we call recalibration techniques. So your baseline is where you're pretty good. You're not too excited. You're not too low. And the technique is what you do to get back to the baseline. Now, different challenges will call for different techniques. So there's one that I could think of that the technique is called redraw the scene. And it specifically refers to where you have a haunting thing that happened in the past. And it doesn't have to even be the bad thing happened. For some people, a bad thing nearly happened, but it was such a bad thing that nearly happened that they're very distressed about how it nearly happened. And that was the example that was shared to introduce this technique. Was a young father, and they had a pool in front of their house, and his young toddler nearly fell into the pool, and they saved the toddler just in time. And then the father was traumatized because he allowed it to happen.
Oh my gosh, I can relate to that so much. Like, same experience.
Yeah. But he was getting to the point where he was very, very distressed and playing it over in his head. What if it had gone bad? How did I let that happen?
Yes. Yep. So guilty of that. It took me like the whole night to get over it, and then reassurance from what happened, if I just don't mind me sharing, was it actually happened over the summer, and I was visiting with my sister-in-law, and she's got 4 children, and one of them is a 18-month-old, so 1.5 years old. So this 18-month-old, she started walking, a few months ago, so she's not very strong on her feet. We went to the beach, and it's a surf beach, and it's one of those beaches that is like really big, like long and sandy, but also the water it doesn't get deep for a long time. So you kind of have to walk out quite a ways to get very deep into the water. And all the kids run off, and there's me and my sister-in-law sitting way up on the beach, where we're pretty much like 50 meters away from the water. And the 18-month-old runs off with the rest of the kids and is not quite as fast as them. So she just kind of hobbles along behind them, and they all rush into the water. and they don't see her behind them. But where me and my sister-in-law Crystal were sitting, we could see everything, right? But because we're so far away, we're like 50 meters away, we're just talking and just a little bit in our own world, having deep in our conversation. I look over to just check on the kids, and I see, and her name is Leah May, getting pummeled by little tiny waves.
Oh my goodness.
And I was like, oh my gosh. And she literally, a wave just went right over her and just completely like submerged her. This is in like knee-high water. It's not even deep, but for a baby, it's like, and the little tiny little waves, but to her, they were just overpowering her. And I felt so helpless because I was 50 meters away. And even if I tried to get up and run, I still wouldn't make it in time because she'd already been like pummeled a few times before that. And I was just like, the adrenaline kicked in and I was like, oh my gosh. And I was like, Crystal. And then I like jumped up. And even though I knew I was going to be helpless at that point, because by the time I get to her, it's going to be probably too late. Luckily, there were adults walking along the shoreline, and they grabbed her and were like, like patting her, and, you know, because she was, you know, crying and distressed and, you know, mouthful of water. And then, and then I get to her and the adults, and I was like, oh my gosh, you know, like, so sorry, she's with us, and she's, you know, and just, I was so mortified and just terrified, and like, it just had all this adrenaline pumping through me. And, I just remember feeling like an absolute failure. Like I'm like the auntie. I'm not even, you know, I'm just like, but I was the adult, you know, and I should have paid more attention to what was going on. And I felt like was putting myself through that agonizing thought of, why didn't I do something sooner? Why didn't I see that happening? Why didn't I know what was going to happen and preempt that and stop her from possibly drowning right in front of our eyes? And Crystal was the one who had to try and calm me down and be like, it's okay, Bianca, it's not your fault, it's nobody's fault, it's okay, she's safe, like, she's fine, you know. And I was like, no, she almost died. She almost drowned. Oh my gosh, it took me the whole night, and I was just like beside myself, like, anyway, this just brings up that experience that you shared, just brings up like that time of that night, that experience. Like, it's really horrible. So I could learn a lot from what you're about to say.
Yes. And it's, you know, there's no judgment. These things happen, and they can happen in a split second. And in this particular scenario, the dad was distracted by the TV. And then by the time he got to the scene, it was pretty intense. Like, I won't get into the details, but suffice it to say that the child was saved, but it was a very, very close call. And so, because the dad was replaying this in his head again and again and going down that negative path, the technique that was given to him was, okay, you're seeing this distressing scene and you're stuck in a loop because you're replaying it in your head again and again. How do you see it? How are you experiencing it? I can almost smell the chlorine in the water. I can see everything in vivid colors, and my heart is pounding, and I can hear shouts and screams, and it feels like my heart stops, and I go racing to the scene. So all of those physiological responses are being repeated again and again and again when the scene is being replayed, even though, yes, there are learnings from it and it's in the past, so all you can do is move forward. But how do you get out of this loop? So the instruction is, take the scene and redraw it in black and white. And if you can do it a step further, reduce it into stick figure lines, including the people, including your son. And what that does is it just takes the heat out of those really intense emotions that are stuck on repeat, you're going to learn from it, but you don't need to torment yourself on and on. So that's the recalibration technique for those
like that.
intense scenes. You probably can't stop yourself from replaying it.
No.
But you just reduce the heat in it. So make it black and white, make it stick figures, make it quite blurry, make it gray, whatever you can do to make the way you relive it less intense. Moving on to the next technique, that's the body scan.
Yeah.
We've all heard of it, but briefly, it's where you bring your awareness through your body, different parts of your body. And one frequently recommended way to do it is when you bring your attention to the muscle group or the spot in your body, say it's your head or your neck, actually tense up those muscles and then release them. And do that periodically through every part. So even if it's your face, just scrunch up your face really hard and then release it. Because when we're hiding tension in these parts of our body, we're so unaware that it's even there. And it's only if you really tense up your shoulders and then let them go that you're activating the muscles to release.
To relaxation mode.
And that's something you can use every day whenever you're stressed. It's not something to save for a rainy day. Or even when you're not stressed, you could do it, say, during your tea break. Go to the bathroom and do half your body, and then in the afternoon break, do the other half. The third technique I wanted to share was removing attachment from emotions. And we know this is in a lot of traditions. The story that I want to share is there was a community worker who was working for the government. And during the course of her work, so she was working in Tasmania, working with a community that was rebuilding following destruction caused by bushfires. And by, during the course of her work, she became depressed. Whatever was causing it, whether it was the situation she was working in or what have you, she knew she was depressed, so she went to get help. So in working with the therapist, she said to them, well, I've been having these feelings for a long time and I've had to stop work. And now I'm stuck on this benefit and I'm trying to get myself well so I can go back to work. But I feel like I'm frozen and now my doctor is telling me I need medication and I'm just so lost. What do I do? What do I do with my depression? And the therapist challenged her by saying, oh, did you catch the depression like you catch the flu, your depression? And she said, what? What do you mean? My depression. I'm depressed. And he said, well, are you depressed 24/7, like as if you had the flu? Or are you having these feelings some of the time? And when she started to think about it that way, she went, hang on, when am I having this? So it switched from something that you are to something that you have. And he got her to do this exercise. So he said, I want you to record every day on a scale of 1 to 10, how big are these flat feelings that you're having? And because of where you're stationed, because you've been doing this government work, she would go through the bush. And he said, when you do your walk through the bush, I want you to reduce your focus to just one thing, whether it's only what you can hear or only what you can see and only what you can smell, etc. So she did the exercise. Each time she walked through the bush, she would go, okay, this time I'm going to see, what can I feel on my cheeks? And she would go, ooh, wind, a bit of coolness, some specks of leaves, whatever it was. And the exercise was then to say, during that walk, where was your depression? And what she found was that when she was focusing on those senses, the depression didn't exist during that walk. but then she would go back to her room and she would start thinking about other things, and then it would come back. So by doing this exercise over a period of time, they were eventually able to identify that she was petrified of going back to work because she didn't get on with the team that she would have to go back to. But she didn't even know that. She didn't know where those feelings were coming from. So this technique is basically using a method to dial down the intensity of your emotions to a manageable point so you can figure out what to do. And you do that by focusing on certain senses and then recording daily at what level you felt that emotion. So to recap, the first thing is that the way we experience our emotions, it's on a continuum. It can be high and low, but it's not constant. It fluctuates. The second thing is that we are not our emotions. Mm-hmm. They're something we can be aware of as they come and go.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
But when we cling to them, that's when we prolong the difficult experience. So number 3 is that we can modulate those emotions by noticing where that dial is sitting on a scale of 1 to 10. And when we start noticing it, we can find out that it's not as high as we are imagining it to be. Mm-hmm. So we're making up a story about how the emotions feel until we ask ourselves how we feel.
Right.
So journaling is how we can help with figuring out where we sit on the dial. And then finally, in order to turn the dial of those difficult feelings down, we practice noticing other senses during a period of time. It can be a daily practice at a scheduled time, or it can be whenever we're feeling very, very intense. Then at that point, we say, okay, I'm going to check in with what I can hear right now, and then measure, how did I feel before? How did I feel after?
Got it. Thank you for sharing. I'm trying to take it all in.
It's a lot.
But no, it's not that it's a lot. And there was only a few points there that you shared, but they're quite, it's quite good to learn different perspectives on how to manage certain emotions. I think what I was trying to understand with that last part about dialing down the emotions, not that was the overall point, but I'm trying to imagine how would someone, if they are, and this is just for my own understanding, if they do find that they don't get along with their teammates, and that's the reason why they don't want to go to work, what would someone do in that situation who has no choice but to go to work and be around their team despite them not getting along with them, but they have to do it because it's their job, and you need a job to work and to pay the bills. So I'm wondering, what is the solution once you've found that this is the trigger?
Yeah,
you know?
Yeah, that's right. So in this example, she decided not to go back to that occupation.
Okay.
But there
some of us who don't have a choice.
Yeah. So
asking for a friend.
The resilience models that we use do actually talk to this kind of situation. I won't get into that because it's a whole other model and it will take time to explain it. But the summary is that you always have a choice.
Exactly.
So in a circumstance where you have a colleague that's very difficult or someone you're dealing with that's difficult, you can choose to leave. And even though, yes, there are consequences to that, like you would have to expend the energy to find a different line of work or a different company to work in, you can never say you don't have that choice. So you're kind of lying to yourself if you say that I can't leave. Well, you can, but it will just be annoying. Mm-hmm. So when you choose not to leave, it's not because you can't. It's because you've chosen that you don't want the difficulty of shifting jobs. The other options open to you are improve your ability to deal with them. So that's, okay, can I learn more about their personality? What are the buttons that get pushed between us that I can work on? And there's things you can look up. There's a book called, I think, pushing the right buttons. I'd have to double check what it's called, but it's all about how everyone has different trigger points. And so by learning about what aggravates you and other people, then suddenly you're coming in with this really strong toolkit and EQ to be able to manage those difficult people. So you can either leave, you can choose to up your game in how you deal with them. You can choose to accept it like it is. Those will be your main options. And, we've talked about mindfulness, meditation, but you can never change the other person.
Yeah,
as
for sure.
such.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You don't have no options, though. You've always got things you can do.
Yeah.
You can also avoid them as much as you can. If you have to work directly with them, that's a problem. But then you just need to make a decision on what your response will be. And no response is also a decision.
Yeah, exactly. With just the topic of resilience, I think it's what am I trying to say? I think what I'm also getting at is that it's good to learn the mechanisms on how we can find out the root cause of something, like assessing our emotions and seeing what's triggering these heightened emotions. But then what we choose to do after that can either be us trying to lean into that resilient kind of characteristic trait that we all have inside ourselves. And how we choose to be resilient, is that by looking for a new job, or is that by trying to change your circumstances, by changing your mindset, or by trying to work on it in an energetic level? Like that experience that I shared with you a few episodes back about how I had difficulty with a coworker, and that took a long time to get through. And I was doing the work on a more of a subtle energy level than a more outward type of level. But that was a decision that I had made inside myself, because I thought that changing jobs wasn't an option, or it was an option, but it wasn't the right option for me at the time, because I thought that the lesson that I'm going to learn from this experience is far greater than walking away from the experience. Do you get what I mean?
Yeah, I understand that.
So I think that's so helpful. The things that you've outlined, so helpful to understand our own thought processes and our own confirmation biases, and the beliefs we tell ourselves, and the reality we choose to, the lens we choose to see our reality through, and then how we can recognize when we are experiencing heightened feelings of emotions, and to really use the technique that you were sharing. What was it called?
Was that removing the attachment from big emotions?
Yes, that's the one. How we could do that to figure out the root cause of what's going on with us, and then from there we can decide on which way we want to take it. Do we want to walk away? Do we want to choose a different path, or do we want to go through the storm?
Yeah. Well,
so to speak.
Sometimes if you don't go through that storm, you'll just go through a different one.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, that we can't, like, people's situations are so complicated, so we can't say whether they should or shouldn't leave.
Exactly.
I know that there have been times where I left a situation and I found it was the best thing that ever happened. However, funnily, the difficulties that I was having in one place did crop up in another place as well. And it was only after I moved the third time that I was all good.
Yeah. So there must have been a lesson that you learnt along the way.
Exactly.
And was able to implement that, so that it was like, okay, karma's not going to keep coming back.
Yeah, she's done with that lesson. Here's the
universe
next one.
going to deliver you a different lesson now.
Yeah, exactly.
So, yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Ruth. It was so helpful. And just to wrap it up a little bit here, because I know we're coming towards the end of our episode, we've looked at the definition of stress and how it impacts our experience. We've also explored the physiological part of stress, what it does to the body. We looked at how the mind plays a big part in how we experience difficulty, and we've seen that it holds the key to giving us the strength we need for all kinds of situations. Some of the techniques Ruth shared were from her favorite book on resilience. It's basically a resilience manual, and she says everyone needs a copy. It's called Resilience by Design by Ian Snape and Mike Weeks. From an astrological perspective, we've seen that our chart can indicate where we may feel like the outsider and the driving force within us to persevere and be the necessary change, either for our own life destiny or to be a dynamic influence in our local or national community. Change doesn't come from being complacent. Change comes from being constantly placed in positions that make us act, to take a stand for what we believe in and be a positive influence to others around us. And remember, the path to your best reality is in your hands to create when you become conscious.